Good morning. My name is Paul Fagan. I'm with the McCain Institute. I oversee our democracy program here at the McCain Institute. So thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation about women, the Wagner Group, and war in both Syria and Ukraine. We felt that this was a very poignant conversation as the war continues to go on Ukraine, but as we also wanted to remind people of the continuing war and the impact the Wagner Group, Russia, has had on Syria. We thought these two elements of what's going on in the global conflicts were important to talk about, but also through the lens of the gender lens, which we believe is very important, as this is an area of great concern. But again, thank you again so much for joining us. Again, we're the McCain Institute, carrying on the legacy of John McCain and his efforts of spreading and focusing on global human rights. With that, I would like to turn it over to Sahana Damapuri from our Secure Future, our partner in our efforts around women, peace, and security, and she will provide some opening remarks and also to introduce our panelists. One note: we will have simultaneous translation for a duration of our program, so just wanted everyone to be aware of that. Thank you, and over to Sahana. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much, Paul and Dr. Farkas. Thanks to the McCain Institute. We're so pleased to be partnering with you. I'm the director of our Secure Future, Women Make the Difference, and we focus on women, peace, and security programs. We are a private family foundation that likes to partner with great institutions like the McCain Institute to really bring a gender lens to current events. We're really pleased to be able to do these types of partnerships to bring that view to everyone, because women, peace, and security, if you know about it, which probably many of you do who are joining, is really about seeing and understanding complex situations, conflicts in a more nuanced and comprehensive way. And that approach is usually achieved through using a gendered lens, and often that approach is led by women and women's civil society leaders in places of conflict and in very fragile environments. So today, we're really looking at the case of Russia and better understanding Russian aggression and its strategies and tactics through a women, peace, and security lens, which I think you'll find very revealing. Our speakers today have really deep experience, lived experience, professional experience in understanding how Russia's military approaches and strategies in Ukraine and Syria mirror each other. And that is what we were really interested in, is the fact that using this lens, talking to people on the ground, particularly women leaders, is showing us a pattern of behavior by Russia and the Wagner Group in particular. And I think that's going to be really important to unpack and to see what the international community needs to know in order to combat these tactics more successfully. And certainly something that Women, Peace, and Security tells us is that our personal security is not something that we can establish in isolation. And so conversations like these, partnerships like these with the McCain Institute, which has such a wonderful high-level audience that really is engaged in these subjects and is looking for innovative ways to address these policy issues, is one of the reasons why we're doing this today. So I'd like to introduce very briefly, our speakers, and then turn the floor over to hearing from each of them. So first we have, I'd like to recognize Dr. Evelyn Farkas, who is the head of the McCain Institute today, joining us today, and has a deep background in these issues in Russia. We also have Alexandra, I hope I'm saying your name right, Matvikich, who is a Ukrainian human rights lawyer and civil society leader based in Kiev, and she heads the nonprofit organization Center for Civil Liberties. And she's been documenting war crimes and has been doing work on democratic reforms in her country. And we also have Nada Al-Rashid, who is a member of the White Helmets and was elected board member in 2019, where she co-leads the White Helmets humanitarian efforts in Syria. And she's also worked with the Qatar Red Cross and as an educator for the last several years in Syria as well. So I think we'll start with what we would call a sort of perspective, a lightning round from each of the speakers. And I'd like to start with Nada Al-Rashid to give us some of your experience and background in your work in Syria, what you're doing, what you're documenting, what you're seeing on the ground.
مرحبا، شكرا كثير لكم. يسعد مساكم جميعا. بتشكركم على دعوتكم لحضوري اليوم.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to share my experience with you. I wanted to speak about my life story. In the period that I spent during the war, I was studying in Damascus University. I was studying business administration because I had aspiration, like the rest of the youth, to graduate and to play a leadership and entrepreneurial role in state institution so that I might have an impact and to have my family be proud of me. This is what I wanted to do, but the reality forced itself harshly on me. It eliminated my dreams, and the world became an open, endless crime scene. I'm one of the women that paid a high price for the war in Syria. I lost 3 brothers because of the airstrikes. With the beginning of the peace movement in Syria, I left my university and I went back to my city, Rastan, in northern Homs, because there was a lot of security focus on the university, and there were detention movements for anyone who is suspected of participating in the demonstration. The escalation by the Syrian regime of violence and killing against demonstrators caused the security crisis in the country until, I'm sorry, you're going to have to ask her to slow down.
Nada, I'm sorry. Do you mind slowing down a little bit for the interpreter, and for anyone who's also listening on Zoom? There is an interpretation available on the bottom of the screen. I should have said that earlier. Probably found it by now.
So my town, Rastan, had a share in this crisis. In the beginning, I couldn't believe how the army that's supposed to protect the people and defend them was the cause of killings and the target of through its ammunition. During this period, I tried as much as possible to be next to my parents, to take care of them, especially after the killing of my brother because of the shelling in 2014. I was also very upset over my brother, but I had to be strong for my family. And at the same time, I saw my dream of graduating from university was reducing. It was difficult to go back to Damascus with the siege on Rastan and many other areas in Damascus as well. All of a sudden, on the 30th of September 2015, everything became different. There was shelling, double sounds of shelling, quite scary. Hospitals were targeted, bakeries, schools, markets were directly targeted. And there was a deliberate shelling of ambulances. It was deliberate. And with following the news, I discovered that there was a Russian intervention directly. From that time, we were denied the basic services like electricity, water, health medical services, education, the shelling aimed to kill the life in our area, to force us to leave or to be displaced like he displaced the other Syrians in Aleppo and Damascus. During these difficult and disastrous events, I had a deep desire to do something. Until I learned that the civil defense asked for women, I immediately signed a request to join because I felt that this is the best thing that I could do. And it is the best organization in Syria. They had a good reputation. Because of the heroic work that we were doing, I started to participate in offering medical services and also first aid to civilians and those injured by the shelling. And we started to sense the suffering of women firsthand in Syria and how this suffering escalated in Syria after they lost their children and their husbands, even the peace that they were living in. My participation with the civil defense was a turning point, an important turning point for me, because I became part of the response to those who were affected. So I was in the heart of what was going on more significantly instead of just following these events. I proved to myself that I can offer people things to marginalized people or weaker people and to contribute to the suffering of women, to reduce or alleviate it. Unfortunately, the Russian shelling was one of the reasons that caused us to leave our lands and even our areas and to accept displacement towards the north. And it was clear the regime is controlling our areas either by displacing us or burying us under the rubble and burning the area entirely. I was displaced in 2018 into the Syrian north, and I lived very harsh days in the beginning until I started to understand what happened and why we were displaced and what is my responsibility and my commitments to work. This prompted me to forget the frustration of the displacement because I started to see bigger disasters and I even started to understand the meaning. I started to see what it means, this monthly, this famous saying that if you see the disasters of others, your disaster becomes easier for you to bear. So I saw women dead while they were alive in the camps because of the huge losses that they went through, their husbands, their children, serious injuries, their inability to get shelter that would protect their privacy, their dignity. So I saw the results of the years of the conflict in the faces of these women in multiple camps in Syria. This increased my frustration and my pain, my mental pain, due to the state that we've become in. The disasters that we saw with the blind eye turned by the international community towards all of the crimes committed by the Russians and the Syrian regime. But I tried to find a solution up until I was able to get psychosocial support services. And over multiple sessions and with the assistance of mental health advisors, I was able to transform my frustration and it to become a desire to stand by these women and to be their voice and to make sure that this suffering only makes me stronger towards my responsibility towards them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nada. And also wanted to recognize that in 2016, the White Helmets was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for their work And maybe we'll be hearing a little bit more about that from Nada later when we get into our conversation. Now I'd like to turn to Alexandra, who also is actually a Nobel Peace Prize winner in 2022 for her work. So please, Alexandra.
Thank you very much for providing me a floor. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I have been documenting war crimes in this war which Russia started against Ukraine in 2014. Our organization, Center for Civil Liberties, in previous 8 years focused on the practice of illegal detention, torture, sexual violence, and killing civilians in the occupied territories. I personally interviewed hundreds of people who survived Russian captivity, men and women, and they told me horrible stories, how they were beaten, raped, how they were smashed into wooden boxes, how they were tortured with electricity, how their fingers were cut, how their nails were torn away, how their nails were drilled. But when large-scale invasion started, we faced with unprecedented numbers of war crimes. So we united our efforts with dozens of organizations, mostly regionals, and we built all Ukrainian network of local documentators, which cover all Ukraine, including the occupied territories, and it's called the Tribunal for Putin Initiative. Working together, we jointly documented since 24 February last year, more than 41,000 episodes of war crimes. 41,000, it's an enormous amount, but it's still a tip of iceberg. And a lot of women and children are victims of these episodes which we documented. I know that war turned people into the numbers because the scale of war crimes grows so large that it became impossible to recognize all stories. But that is why I want to tell you one. This is a story of Svetlana from Chernihiv region who lost her entire family when a Russian missile hit her building. This is her quote. "I heard them dying. My husband was breathing heavily, straining as if he was trying to throw the rubble off himself, but he couldn't. At some point, he just went still. My grandmother and Zhenya died instantly. I heard my daughter crying. Then she also went quiet. As for my son, my mother told me that he called for me several times and then nothing." What I know from my direct work with people affected by this war, that people are not numbers. And that is why we must provide a chance for justice for all victims of this war. We must return people their names and their human dignity. And all this hell, which we now face in Ukraine, is a result of total impunity which Russia enjoyed for decades. Russian troops commit horrible war crimes in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Mali, in Syria, in Libya, in other countries of the world. So the bombardment of Aleppo became possible because Russians were never punished for destruction of Grozny, a city of 500,000 people. And firebombing of Mariupol became possible because Russians have never been punished for bombardment of Aleppo. And that is why we feel a historical responsibility to break the circle of impunity which Russia enjoyed for decades. And when large-scale invasion started, I started to ask to myself, for whom do we document all these crimes for? Because as a human rights lawyer, I understand that we face with accountability gap, which have several dimensions. The first dimension is that there is no international court which can prosecute Putin and high political leadership and top military command of Russian state for the crime of aggression. Because all these atrocities which we now documented, it's result of their leadership decision to plan, to initiate, and to start this war. And that is why it's so essential to establish a special court of aggression and hold Putin, Lukashenko, and their surrounding accountable. And second dimension is based on the fact that we face with unprecedented number and level of human pain. The International Criminal Court will limit its investigation only to several selected cases, and national system is overloaded with an extreme amount of crimes. So we need international system to be able to provide chance for justice to all people, regardless who they are, their social position, the type of crime they endured, and whether or not media or international organizations are interested in their cases. So we have to find a way how to ingrain international element into the level of national investigation and national justice, like a model where national judges work together with international judges, national investigators, national detectives work together with international investigators and detectives. And I want to conclude my introductory remark with the role of women in this war, because we have to speak not just and present women not just victims of this Russian war against Ukraine. I know a lot of fantastic women who do essential work in different fields, who fight for freedom and for our democratic choice. Women document war crimes, women take important political decisions, women coordinate huge civil initiatives. Women are on the forefront of this battle because bravery has no gender. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for your work and sharing your stories and the stories of those in Ukraine who are suffering right now. Dr. Farkas, I'd like to turn to you and hear your background. And of course, you have such a deep background in the area of Russia, but also I think we'd love to hear your insights on looking at Ukraine and Syria in this perspective.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Sahana, for organizing this and for the support and partnership between our two organizations. And again, thank you to Alexandra and to Nada for time to speak and share with us the reality that they have been experiencing so painfully, even if they haven't experienced everything firsthand. They have had the, I cannot even imagine, compounded impact of experiencing secondhand all of the accumulated human rights violations. So that is a big burden that both of you are bearing for your people. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for bearing witness, and thank you for getting accountability. I want to underscore a couple of points that our two speakers raised. First, just very quickly with my background, I'm a foreign policy wonk, I guess, who's worked in the executive branch and the legislative branch in the United States. I have 30 years plus experience, including working in Bosnia and a post-conflict area. So my passion and interest is actually in ethnic conflict and putting an end to it. Here at the McCain Institute, we focus on democracy and human rights, and we focus on getting things done. We're not a think tank. We work with leaders and we create leaders. So I think that gives you a little bit of a sense of why we're doing this at the McCain Institute, and a little bit of how I fit into the picture. My last job in the US government was as President Obama's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia. I'm also the first woman to run the McCain Institute. I want to underscore how important it is that we understand that there is a line that connects Chechnya all the way through Georgia, Moldova, Syria, very emphatically Syria, because from Chechnya to Syria, it's very clear, and then to Ukraine today, to this latest phase of the war in Ukraine. What connects it is the Russian way of war. And as Nada mentioned, in Syria, we saw the Russian military through air. So the Russian involvement in Syria is primarily through their air forces there, and the Wagner militia on the ground, this mercenary force. And in Syria, the Russians essentially adopted the same kind of measures that they had an attempt to achieve independence for Chechnya, which is part of the Russian Federation in the late 1990s, well, throughout the 1990s. In 2003, because of the Russian actions against the Chechen people, which Alexandra also mentioned, the United Nations declared Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, the quote, the most destroyed on earth in 2003. As we just look at the map now of Ukraine, but we flash back to what happened in Syria. These Russian tactics are the ones that they have employed. It's a military playbook, make no mistake about it. They throw the Geneva Conventions out the window and they wage war against innocent civilians, primarily women and children. So we have seen this time and time again. In 2015, the United Nations negotiated for a humanitarian convoy to go through, as Nada was mentioning, to Syria to provide goods. What did the Russians do? They bombed that convoy. They bombed the United Nations convoy. And unfortunately, the international community did not grasp the full scale, the full scope, the full seriousness of what the Russians were doing in Syria. It took this latest phase of the war in Ukraine, the international community, to wake up and to realize what the Russians have been doing, what they were doing, and frankly, what they will do if people like Alexandra and Nada are not successful in achieving accountability, and if we are not successful in helping them do so. So it's very important to underline that the Russian way of war involves using air power, using artillery and mortars to destroy civilian settlements, to force civilians out. In the case of Syria, they also managed to use the refugees as a weapon against Western Europe, refugee flows, destabilizing the politics there, and frankly, turning the politics in a direction that was not helpful to the innocent people of Syria. We've also seen them use the Wagner mercenary group all over the world, including, again, in Syria and in Ukraine. I want to say a few things about, so that's why accountability is important. I want to say a few things, and then I think we should go back to our expert panelists about the role of women in all of this. First of all, many people sort of are quiet about what the situation is on the Russian side. But as somebody who has interfaced with high-level Russian military and defense officials, as a woman, I know that in the Russian system, there are very few women, if any, who have any sort of authority in the Russian defense establishment, in the Russian foreign ministry, in the Russian armed forces. The Russian women who are at senior levels tend to be mouthpieces of the government. They're the spokespeople. In the economic sector, there are some senior women, but the absence of women is also a factor, a variable on the other side that I think merits mention. We have seen great courage in Syria and in Ukraine, and we've heard about that this morning. 15% of the Ukrainian armed forces today are women, according to their wonderful ambassador, Ukraine's ambassador here in the United States. So we know that Ukrainian women are fighting. We know that Ukrainian women are defending their children to the best of their ability. We know that they are mobilized as a civil society. And one of the things I learned, and then I conclude, when I met with a very senior Scandinavian during a trip to Finland and Sweden, was that the Russian society, I suppose I didn't learn it, but what I heard from a very wise observer of Russian society is that there is no civil society. The way he put it, he said, they don't work together. And what he meant by that was that there is no civil society. People don't band together to protect what it is to be Russian, to protect human rights all over the world, to protect themselves from being, frankly, dragged into this horrible war, because Putin, make no mistake, is also committing a human rights abuse against his country, the people of his country, especially the men of fighting age, or whatever that is in Russia today. So the reality is that in Russia, there is no real civil society. People as individuals try to hunker down and pretend this is not happening. And that is not the case in Ukraine today, and that is not the case in Syria when it comes to the White Helmets and other Syrians who are working actively to try to push back against Bashar al-Assad. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Sahana.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Farkas. I mean, that picture brings together both Nada and Alexandra's experience, and particularly with this, a couple of things I want to pull out and would love to hear Nada and Alexandra's reflections on this. When you talked about the Russian way of war and this line connecting Chechnya through Syria to Ukraine, the tactics of using military power to target civilian populations, for one thing, but also your insight into the very weak civil society in Russia. Those are two things that from the women, peace and security lens, we know that when civil society is very strong, you have a strong, healthy, resilient democracy. And usually civil society is led by women. The other piece of this is the thread that you've pulled through and you've helped us see that Nada and Alexandra's experience is showing us too, is that women are actually documenting that thread more than any other groups. Women civil society leaders are documenting that thread. And I think for Nada, I guess I'd like to turn to you and ask you to tell us a little bit more about the white helmets and how are the women's groups documenting what is happening in Syria. I'm not sure if we still have Nada with us.
And
Yeah.
also, Sahana, if I could mention to everyone, you should have
هلا للنساء في سوريا دور حاسم.
Nada, can you give us 1 second? I think Dr. Farkas wanted to just...
I just wanted to say, just in case people didn't realize, because I, for one, have never used this before, in the bottom of your screen, there is translation. If you click on it, you can find the language that you want to hear. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Farkas. Go ahead, Nada. Apologies.
Thank you. Women in Syria are decisive when it comes to documenting all war crimes and the needs of communities. We're going through tough times in Syria and we're exerting huge efforts. We are collecting evidence, raising awareness, calling for justice and accountability. We have so many examples of women who were able to leave positive mark in this regard and impacted positively the lives of Syrians. They paid a high price for that, like Razan Zaytouna, Samira Khalil. And at the beginning of the popular movements were really important for mobilizing women, especially in areas under besiege. Women have now different roles, and they have different roles in the past. They have different roles in popular movements. For example, they participated in coordinating revolution and worked with the youth. Women were also present in media. They conveyed what was happening on the ground to the international community, and women documented all violations that were committed or perpetrated by the Assad regime and Russia against civilians. Women participated in collecting and documenting evidence, like I said, physical violence, torture, coercive disappearance, assaults on civilians. And they worked with international human organizations to document evidence correctly in order to use them for legal proceedings. Also, many women provided vital services for the victims of war crimes, especially women and children who were subject to domestic-based violence. They also provided psychological support, legal aid, health services, security services. Survivors were able to heal because of these services. Many women also use different platforms, different channels to raise awareness on the impact of war crimes on women, children, and the overall society. They participated in advocacy efforts on the national level and international level. Women tried to influence policies as well, mobilize resources, and pressure for accountability to hold war criminals accountable. Women also built alliances and coalitions with other civil society organizations, whether inside Syria or on the international level. They worked with other groups and alliances in order to maximize their voices. So they shared knowledge, resources. They worked collectively to meet the needs of the damaged communities. Women, like I said, had a good role in documenting evidence, meeting different needs. They were able to highlight the experiences of marginalized and vulnerable groups. They highlighted the different forms of violence, gender-based violence, for example. They also contributed to justice services, accountability, through providing different support services for the survivors. We can say that they helped mitigate circumstances for individuals and communities. These are the most effective roles that women had. These were affected by social norms, of course. Women needed to understand local communities. In order to have effective contribution, you need to understand the local community. Also, we need to understand the difference between men and women. Women were well equipped to meet the different needs. They understood the vulnerabilities of women and children, especially those going through war. So they understood well that it's important to provide needs based on gender needs. Women were able to reach out through their robust networks to different individuals and communities. They were able to mobilize local communities to reach out to bigger audiences, to share knowledge and information on war crimes. They're determined to help others. They're flexible, and they were qualified to document evidence and call for justice.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nada. I think, what you're saying, Nada, is something that I'd love to hear Alexander also reflect on. One is that women civil society leaders are really the ones who are continuing to keep society together during a conflict crisis. But also you mentioned a lot that the women civil society leaders are also documenting these crimes. I think for my question for Alexander, because you had, from your work, and you had mentioned the bombardment of Aleppo and the things that you're documenting, I wonder, I think it would be interesting for the audience to also hear, what are the obstacles that you see women having when they're presenting these cases, putting this forward, documenting this evidence, and showing the connections between Aleppo and Ukraine?
I would like to start with the point that this Russian war against Ukraine is not just a war between two states. This is a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. And each of these systems correspond to its own set of values and attitudes. And in the Russian world, a woman performs only assigned for her roles in the family and society, and a man must dominate by definition. An authoritarian regime is based on these cultural attitudes, because established relations between people reflect the society's idea of what political power can be. Whether there will be some space for dignity and freedom of choice in relations with the authorities. The idea of what acceptable governance practice are. And in this way, personal becomes political. That is why in Norway, women have equal rights with men. In Afghanistan, women are forbidden to study at universities. And in Russia, domestic violence is decriminalized because it's always a projection of what the government itself does to people in this country. And that is why when I speak about the role of women in this war, we speak not just about women who document war crimes. We speak, for example, about women who defend our country, our democratic choice, and our people, like my friend Andriana Susak, who left her 6-year-old son when large-scale invasion started and joined Ukraine armed forces. And that is why I want to emphasize that when large-scale invasion started, a lot of people joined Ukrainian army. And there is no surprise that 60,000 of women are among them. But return to your question, when we as a women presented this link of impunity, which is lasting for decades, and the necessity to break this impunity, not just for Ukrainians, but also for other nations who can be possible next Russian target. I see that the problem is that a lot of politicians in different countries are still looking to the world through the prism of Nuremberg trials, where Nazi war criminals were tried, but only after Nazi regime had collapsed. And we try to convince that justice must be independent of the magnitude of Putin's regime's power. We live in a new century. We must move further. We cannot wait. We must establish special tribunal now and hold Putin, Lukashenko, and other guilty in this crime accountable.
Thank you so much. I think your point about the war between two systems of authoritarianism and democracy is very apt. And I think all three of you have pointed to various aspects of democratic societies and democratic functioning that protects and defends human rights of others and the ability of women to keep society running through those networks, through that communication. And so Dr. Farkas, I'd like to turn to you to both perhaps comment on that link of democracy and authoritarianism, what we're seeing, but I think also with regard to the Russian military strategy, I wonder if you could comment on any changes you're seeing since 2014 or 2015 in the Russian military strategy in comparing Syria and Ukraine, and just how are they responding to setbacks?
Yeah. So, Sahana, first of all, with regard to Alexandra's point about autocracy versus democracy, that is correct. I mean, we really are in a standoff right now. There is room for states that are not democratic to also be on the right side. And what I mean by that is if you are a non-democracy, let's say you're a South Asian monarchy or something like that, or some other form of government that's not democratic, but not outright autocratic, there is also a place for you to side with human rights and human dignity and with the international community, because there is an international order that we established. The UN Charter says that the borders are sacrosanct, that sovereign states have borders that must not be altered through the use of military force. We established that principle in the UN Charter. That was the first principle that we established after World War II. And when we saw that violated in 1990-91, when Saddam Hussein seized Kuwait, annexed Kuwait, the international community rallied and pushed Saddam Hussein, pushed Iraq out of Kuwait. We unfortunately did not have the same reaction when Putin went in and illegally annexed Crimea, part of Ukraine. So I think the international community, there are many other countries that are on the fence, as we say, who could also join in this coalition for accountability and for sovereign rights of Ukraine. Second, the other principle of the UN Charter, as Alexandra knows very well, and everyone here knows very well, is human rights. You can have sovereign borders, but within your borders, you must treat people according to certain principles of human dignity and human rights. Those are outlined in the UN Charter as well. And all states sign up to this bargain, essentially. Other states won't come in and seize parts of your territory so long as you provide at least a minimum amount of sanctity or of safety for your citizens. And that is essentially the crux of the deal since World War II. That's, broadly speaking, certainly kept us out of global war. So I think it's important to understand that yes, it's autocracy versus democracy, but there are other ways that other states can get involved in a constructive fashion, states that might not feel comfortable with this type of scenario, with the way that we're framing it. Now, with regard to the way that the war has changed, I think what is alarming is that the Russian government has made a decision essentially to come out of hiding, if you will, with regard to their intent. Their intent with regard to Ukraine is absolutely neo-colonial, revanchist. It's ethnic cleansing. It's an attempt to eliminate the Ukrainian identity in the Ukrainian state. And this is important because here again, we have to stand up for the international order. Large states cannot do this to states that are smaller than them just because they have the military capability. And so it's very important for us to stand up against what Russia's doing. And I think most people here understand, if you understand the mindset of Putin and his objectives and those around him, they have an imperial idea here. They would like to regain control over Ukraine because they had some control under the pro-Putin leader, Yanukovych, several years ago when the Maidan revolution occurred. And they would like to control Georgia, Moldova, and then they will try to destroy NATO because it's the only operational alliance, the only alliance of states that will stand up for democracy, for human rights, for sanctity of borders. And that is a challenge that Putin, that is why he believes that NATO is a threat to him. So I think I would just say that those are the stakes. That's one way to frame it. In terms of your question about how the war tactics have changed, because the Russians are no longer hiding their intent, they have come out of the woods and they are destroying Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. They are trying to bring them to their knees by sapping their will and frankly by getting the international community to withhold assistance to Ukraine. And it's frankly had the opposite effect. The international community has been shocked, and certainly starting first in the neighborhood in Europe and in the United States and North America, United States and Canada. And by the way, the second largest Ukrainian population, I think, outside of Ukraine is in Canada. There has been universal shock and dismay and horror. And so we have provided economic, political, and military assistance to Ukraine, increasing in scope and hopefully deepening and accelerating and achieving the objective that we all have to sign up for, which is expelling the Russians from Ukrainian territory, providing a decisive defeat to Putin and his foreign policy. And this part is really important because accountability and defeat go hand in hand. I agree with Alexandra that we should all start, working to achieve accountability now. But the Russians will continue to use this methodology if the Russian government and the Russian people do not understand that what they are doing is so fundamentally wrong and so such a humongous, heinous crime. The Russian people, unfortunately, have to be faced with what their government has done in their name.
And could I ask you a follow-up question on actually a little bit, if you could speak a little bit to the Wagner Group's role in the Russian aggression that we're talking about.
Well, the Wagner Group for a long time had a little bit of a distant, hands-off relationship publicly with the Russian government. Of course, those of us who followed the Russian military and the Russian armed forces knew that the Wagner Group was working at the direction of the Kremlin, but that was something that they didn't acknowledge publicly. Now it's more of a public, I mean, the Wagner Group is out as a force working together, although of course there's a lot of tension in the relationship with the Russian military on the ground in Ukraine. And the Wagner Group is a mercenary group that uses despicable tactics. We've seen some of it recorded. They trumpet the fact that they execute their own soldiers for showing let's say a desire not to continue attacking Ukrainians, or a desire to surrender, or a desire to leave when their time is up. They will execute them. The prisoners who have been returned to Wagner, one of whom was horribly and famously killed with a hatchet. And these are things that the Wagner Group takes pride in. And these are the worst, violations of international law, of the Geneva Conventions. So it is, unfortunately, we have to be really careful that these kinds of mercenary groups and what they do, first of all, that they don't get away with being held accountable because the Russian government is giving them this power. Second, that they also don't normalize this kind of brutality on the battlefield. So again, all I can say is that the Wagner Group injects an element of open brutality, and it provides also other useful mechanisms for the Kremlin to put pressure on the U.S. military.
Thank you. Well, I see we have just a few minutes left. We're almost at the end of our time, but I wanted to maybe close out the conversation with a few remarks from each of you to ask one final question, which is really, I think I'd like to give you each a ability to have a call to action. What is the one thing that you would request of the international community right now to do? And I'd like to start with Nada, and then go to Alexandra, and end with Dr. Farkas.
First of all, I would like to thank you very much. Our requests on behalf of Syrians is as political solution. 2254 resolution needs to be enforced. The second request is to hold all war criminals accountable in Syria. All war criminals. The third request is not to make humanitarian assistance as a tool for negotiations at the expense of civilians. We are blackmailed by the regime and Russia using humanitarian aid. So on behalf of Syrians, I would say that we need to have direct access to humanitarian aid without using it as a tool for blackmailing us. All the displaced also need to go back to their areas with guarantees of their rights. All detainees need to be released. All detainees in the regime prisons need to be released. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Alexandra.
When large-scale invasions started, the well-developed democracies told, let's help Ukraine not to fail. And Ukraine started to receive the first weapons to be able to defend ourselves. And first serious sanctions against Russia were introduced into the force. But it's time to change the narrative to another one. Let's help Ukraine to win fast. because there is a huge difference between let's help Ukraine not to fail and let's help Ukraine to win past.
I agree 100%. And my message consistently since I left, actually when I was even in the administration in 2014, 15, my consistent message has been that we need to provide more to Ukraine fast. It is our moral obligation to help Ukraine defeat Russia as fast as possible, because every day that we take longer to defeat Russia, more Ukrainians die on the battlefield and in their homes, in their cities, in their towns. So it is also a moral imperative to help defeat Russia as fast as possible. And then I believe that it is our responsibility, and when I say our, it's the international community, to achieve accountability, not just for Ukraine, but also for Syria, and if we can do it for the Chechens as well. It's really important to remind the international community of what the Syrians suffered, because we didn't step up and defend the Syrians, because we didn't step up and speak loudly about what was happening there, or loudly enough. Putin felt he could do it again. And that's what we have to stop for now and forever.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. And I think I will just underscore the importance of hearing from women leaders who are bringing to the table that women are on the front lines in conflict, and often they can see and have information that is much more comprehensive and nuanced about the situation happening, and can often make connections that are very advantageous to policymakers here and to the international community. So I really want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today and for providing insights into this ongoing conflict. And I think, as Alexandra said, this war between two different worlds of democracy and autocratic regimes, and what we can actually do right now to impact that for the world. So thank you all. And I would actually end on one of our panelists, as some of the audience may know, is not able to join us today. He's provided a short video of remarks, which will be posted on the website, which you can view later. But thank you to everyone. Thank you so much to the McCain Institute for hosting this important discussion, and for Nada and Alexandra, and all the courage and the work and everything that you've done to promote and defend human rights and democracy and the people in your country. Thank you.